Welcome to Part 5b, in our tutorial series on how to develop a Contras-like game, with free visual engine Gdevelop. We have had to split the video in two different and independent subparts, as it ended being very long to cover all the content. This part nonetheless is still 1 hour long, as we have implemented the enemy AI, with a patrolling behavior between two waypoints, a fire rate and a number of rounds with a pause between them. The player detection is performed by a Raycast, which makes the enemy changes its state and start firing at the player. For now, we have not modularized the AI, as we were more focused in actually having it working correctly. In the next episodes we'll make it modular as to be able to apply it and have it working on several enemies. Part A and B are independent, but if you have not seen it yet, you can watch it now by following the link on screen and in the description. Let's check what we have done in the previous video. So, the camera is now following the player, and we have started to model the level, by putting platforms more or less at the same place where they are in the original game. We have also integrated a background from the original game for visual reference, and that will be replaced later on with our own level art. In this video, since we will be concentrated on the enemy AI, and not in the character movement, we will temporarily disable it in the first minutes of the video as to make easier to find the different game objects used. Time to create our first enemy. We could have gone through different solutions, but we have decided to use the same implementation that we have used for the player. An invisible physics block that deals with the physics and movement, and then a sprite and its animations linked to it in the game. Create a new object of type sprite, and name in a descriptive way. In our case we are going to use the same format of naming, physics enemy. Click the Add Animation, and then Edit with Piskel. Select a color that suits your enemy. We will be going with red, and with the bucket tool paint the canvas in red. In the top bar, click on the sprite name and name it with the same name that you have used in the previous step. In our case, physics enemy, and click on the Save button. Now, click on the Behavior tab, to add a platformer character behavior to our enemy, as we will be moving it as we are doing with the player. For now, you can left the default values, we will be revisiting the properties later on to fine-tune the enemy movement to our needs. Click Apply to save the changes. Drag the physics enemy to the screen, as to instance it and start modeling its behavior. The object is behind the background, so for now it will be the best to disable it, as to be able to work without having it blocking our view to the game elements. For that, click on it and then, in the Properties pane on the left, assign it to the game background, and then in the Layers interface click on the I button that will disable all the objects that are on the game background layer. If you are not seeing the Layers interface, remember that you can open it by clicking on the Layer button in the top bar of the user interface. Click on the physics enemy object, and make sure that it is on the main field of view. In the Properties pane, assign it to the game layer as to avoid having problems with the camera follow. Click on the Events Manager tab and let's implement our first events to control the enemy. Since we are starting a new group mechanics, it is better to differentiate them in the events window. We could create an independent event sheets and then include them in the main one, but for now, we will keep everything on the same working event sheet, and we'll just organize the events using the concept of group, that allows us to list in a contiguous way all the events integrated within the group. To create a new group, go to the top bar on the Gdevelop UI, and we will find a button represented by a large plus sign to add events. When clicking on it, it will open a submenu where you have to select Group. At the bottom of the event sheet, a new group is created. Click on it to rename it to Enemy. Next, click on the Add Event option to start adding events for the enemy. Let's try to make the enemy move to the left as soon as the game is executed. For that, leave the condition empty, and click on the Action option. Select the physics enemy and then in the action list choose the Simulate control. In the key text box choose the left key. Before proceeding, let's check if it is working and we have our enemy moving to the left. Click the play button. The enemy starts immediately to move to the left and jumps out of the platform for an infinite fall. We need the enemy to be patrolling between two waypoints. For this, we need to tell it when to turn back and start moving in the opposite direction. The easiest way is to use a sprite that when colliding with the enemy will indicate him what to do next, in this case turning back. We will be creating two different blocks, one for turning right, and the other one for turning left. This way, we will be able to keep the enemy moving back and forth between those two waypoints. Let's create the blocks. Go to the scene view and let's add a new sprite object, by clicking the plus sign on the Object Manager interface. Give it a name, in our case we will be naming it Enemy Go Right, as it will be the first block implemented and we know that our enemy is currently moving to the left. Click Add Animation to add a new animation. Click on Edit with Piskel. Choose a color and with the bucket tool paint the canvas, then, with the brush in white, we will draw an arrow pointing to the right. This will allow us to understand clearly the purpose of the block when debugging the game. Name it with the same name on the Piskel name top bar, and then click the Save button. Repeat the overall process for the block that will tell the enemy to go to the right. When finished, drag the two blocks to the game level, and place them in random places near the player. Go to the Events tab, and in the Enemy group let's add the basic functionality of making the enemy moving in the opposite direction. For that, add a new event, and in the condition, select the physic enemy and in the condition list, search for the collision and then in the list of objects, the Enemy Go Right object. Click OK to close the dialog box. When the condition is met, we want the enemy to move to the opposite direction that it was moving. But for that, we actually need to know in which direction it is moving. For this to happen we need an object variable associated with the enemy that will hold the direction in which it is traveling. So, let's go back to the scene view, and then select the physic enemy object in the object pane and then on the three dots on the right of the name, or by right-clicking on the object. This will open a small dialog window with several options. In the video you are not able to see it, as it opened to the outside of the physical window but chose the option Edit Object Variables. In the new window, click the Add button to add a new variable that we are going to call Direction, that as the name shows it, will hold the direction in which the enemy is moving. Click Apply to save, and now, switch back to the Events Manager, and on the event that we started to input previously, add another condition to the physic enemy. In the search box type variable, select the option value of an object variable. In the text box variable type or select direction, the variable that we just created. In the sign of the test choose the option equal to and then in the value type -1. What we are checking is basically if the enemy has collided with the block Go Right and the value of direction is -1, meaning that is moving to the left, then we should rotate into the other direction. So, for the action, choose again physic enemy and then for the action to flip it horizontally. Let's add a new action associated with the physic enemy and choose the Simulate control to the right. Copy the entire event and paste it and modify the directions to reflect moving to the right and finding the block that will make the player character switch back to the left direction. In this case, the direction is holding now the value 1, and the enemy should be flipped. The simulate control should be set to the left. Now, we need to make sure the enemy direction value is initialized correctly when starting the game. Let's go to the first event in the event sheet, that has a condition at the beginning of the scene, and add a new action for the object physic enemy. In the search box, type variable and then select the option modify a variable of an object. For the variable select direction, for the operation, set to and set the value to -1. Let's go to the action that we created earlier without a condition and that is responsible for making the character move to the left. Add a new condition. Select the physic enemy and then the value of the object variable direction. If it is equal to -1, then we want to simulate control to the left, and if not, we want to simulate control to the right. Click on the event as to see a surrounding box and then copy-paste the entire event, by pressing Ctrl+C or by right-clicking on the event and select the option copy-paste, and make the modifications to make the enemy move to the right when the value of direction is 1. Time to check our creation. The enemy is moving correctly to the left, but when reaching the position where the block go right should be located, instead of turning back it stops. Plus, the block is not where it is supposed to be and as we have placed it in the editor. We have already seen this problem, when the objects are outside of the game layer. Go to the scene view and assign both block go left and go right to the layer game. Let's check again. Nope. We still have the same problem. Let's check on the events again. Okay. The problem is that we actually don't need to set the simulate control when colliding with the blocks, and we have forgot to actually change the value of the object variable direction. We are going to delete the simulate control action in each of the events, and replace it by new actions that are going to set the value of direction. Let's start by the condition associated with going right. Click Add Action and then select Physic Enemy. In the search bar type Variable, and select the option Modify Value of an Object Variable. In the Variable box, select Direction, then in sign of the text field, select the option Set To. Finally in the field Value, type the number 1, because we are telling the object to go to the right. Repeat for the go left and changing the direction value with -1. Let's check again. We have solved the problem, and now the enemy is moving correctly back and forth between the two controlling blocks. It is time to fine-tune slightly the behavior as currently it is going too fast. Double-click on the physic enemy object, and then click on Behaviors. Let's adjust the values of some of the parameters associated with the platform character behavior. The values that we are using are for our references. Feel free to modify them to suit your needs and the specificities of your game. For the acceleration, we are going to decrease it to 750. For the max speed, let's use 150. And let's change the deceleration to the same value than acceleration, 750. Click on Apply to save the changes and click on Run to preview the new parameters. That's better, the movement is more in line with the game. So, by now, we have an enemy that is able to move between two waypoints in the game, but that is totally ignoring our player. This is not the typical behavior that we would expect and want from our typical enemy. This means that it is time to create some way for the enemy to actually sense the player when coming into its range. There are several ways we could implement the feature. One possible way could be to have an image in front of enemy, and that moves with it, and that will serve as the line of sight. When the image is colliding with the enemy, then this would mean that the player has been detected should be attacked. Another possible way is to use a function that is available on most of the game engines, a Raycast, that is a ray that is originated in a specific point of the enemy towards a predefined direction and that if hitting the player, will trigger the attack. Both solutions have positive and negative points to it, like for instance, and image can be used to map correctly a situation where the enemy is able to detect the player in front and behind of its current position. With a Raycast, we would need two of them to cover the situation. Since we think that probably the Raycasting is a more complex, but the more flexible solution, we will implement our solution with it. For this, go to the Events Manager, create a new event and add a new condition. In the conditions search box, type Raycast and select the option named Raycast. Gdevelop will ask on the right pane what is object the rays needs to be test against. For now, let's choose our Sprite player, but in the future we will have to modify it to be against physic player as to make it suitable for all player skins. Then we have to set the origin positions for the ray, which will be set to our physic enemy X and physic enemy Y. For the angle at which the ray should be casted, we can use the propriety angle of our objects, so in this case, physic enemy angle. Later on we will have to make sure that the propriety angle is correctly updated when modifying the state of the enemy during the turns. Let's input how far the ray will travel, which in our case will be 600 pixels. Since for now we just want to check if we have detected the player, we will not take in consideration the variable to save the positions X and Y of the object. Click OK to close. We need now to be able to save the information on whatever the player has been detected and is in our range. For this, go to the scene view, select the physic enemy, right-click on IT and select Edit Object Variables. In the new window, click on the Add button and input the name of the new variable, which in our case, will be player in range. Click Apply to save and close the window. Let's go back to the Events Manager view. In the new event that we just created for the Raycast, add a new action for the object physic enemy and the variable object just created, where we are going to set the value to 1 to reflect that the player has been detected and is in range. Now, we can modify the two events that makes the enemy move right and left, by adding to each of them a new condition where we are testing if the player is not in range, or that the value of the variable player in range has a value of 0. This will cause the enemy to stop when detecting the player in its range of action. In order to make the events more readable, what we can do, is to actually put this condition as a main event, and then move the two controlling events as sub-events. So inside of the enemy group, create a new sub-event, and drag the condition checking if the player is not in range to the condition field of this new event. Now drag to the right the movement events as to indent them below the new one. Time to check the behavior and see if we have achieved what we expected. Well, it seems that it is somewhat working as the enemy comes now to a full stop a couple of pixels away from the player. So, if it detected the player, then it should start to shoot at it. Let's make it happen. Go back to the Events Manager, and copy the full event that we have just created, to check that the player is not detected. Paste it after the first check, and now let's modify it to reflect the case where the value is 1 and the enemy has detected the player. Delete the two sub-events copied, and then in the action field, let's try to shoot at the player. So select the bullet object and then in the action list, the action create object. For the X, choose the physic enemy X and for the Y physic enemy Y. Be sure to set the layer to be game, or you will have problem with your bullets once they get created in the screen. Next, let's add a force to the bullet so to make it move toward the player. The angle for the add force should be set to the physic enemy angle propriety, and for the speed use the same speed as for the player's bullets, 900 pixels. By mistake at this point, we forgot to select the permanent option for the force. So, don't be like us and select it. Let's check the result in the game. In our case, since we made the mistake of not setting the force to permanent, we can see that the bullets are being created but are not moving. In your case, you will probably be seeing the bullets flying towards the player. Click OK, apply to close. Since the enemy is shooting a lot of bullets, we want to control how many bullets it will be able to fire at all times, so go back to the scene view, select physic enemy in the objects list and then right-click on it, click the three dots on the right. From the dialog box, choose Edit Object Variables and let's add a couple of more variables. Fire rate and has fired. Once done, click Apply to close. Let's go back to the Events Manager, and add a new condition to the event where we are testing that the player is in range. Select Physic Player and then Value of an Object Variable, and for the variable select Has Fired have the value 0, meaning that it has not fired. Click OK to close. Add another condition again associated with the object physic enemy, but in this case select Value of a timer and in the time field, enter physic enemy variable fire rate, which will check if the timer has passed the fire rate period. Click OK to close. This will make now the enemy to shoot with a predefined fire rate. So once we have fired, we should reset the time next fire, just like we did for the player. So, add a new action for physic enemy and for the action select Reset Time. In the name of the field type in next fire. Let's move it to be the first action in the event, as to make sure that it gets reset immediately. At this stage, in our case, we are going to change to force mode of the bullet to permanent. If you have already solved it as indicated early on, you don't need to do anything. Let's deal also immediately with the effects associated with firing the bullets, so instead of typing everything again, we can copy the actions for the player fire event and use them in the enemy fire. Modify all the references from gun to physic enemy as to make sure that everything is referring to the right object when created. Let's go also to the event associated with the begin of the scene and let's reset there the next fire timer associated with physic enemy. Let's play the game to see the results. Well, the enemy is firing without taking in account the fire rate. It is also firing in the wrong direction, and all the effects are being in wrong location. We already know this bug, it is the layer where effects are being rendered, so it should be easy to solve. Let's go back to the events. Let's think for a while. So this condition that should be checking the fire rate is not working. We have shot a large number of bullets without control, so this means that the condition for the timer is not working. Since the timer is automatically increased, the problem must be with the fire object variable. Let's move to the top of events, where we are initializing everything, to see what we could be doing wrong. Okay. The problem is that we are not initializing the value for physic enemy fire rate. Let's solve it. Copy the initialization of the gun fire rate and paste it. Change the reference to physic enemy. Run the game to see if it solves that issue. Yes, the enemy is now firing with the fire rate, but of course still in the wrong direction. Let's first fine-tune the fire rate and increase it to 0.50 and check how it looks in the game. Better. Let's check now on why the angle, at which the enemy is firing, is wrong as, theoretically, it should be looking to the left. For that, go back to the Events Manager, and let's initialize the angle for physic enemy. Since we are telling the enemy to start moving immediately to the left, let's set the angle for the object to 180 degrees. Check the game again. And we can see that now the enemy is firing in the right direction toward the player. Time to fix the effects, which is easy. Go to the event associated with enemy fire and then in the actions that are creating the bullet and their effects change for each of them the layer to the layer where a game is set game. If you are using a different name, then this should be the name of the layer where you are putting your game characters and assets. Let's check the game again. The enemy is firing correctly at us, let's try to avoid his fire. Strange. When we move, the enemy is copying our movements as if we were controlling it too. There must be some strange misconfiguration there. But we can also see that the enemy don't stop shooting once we are able to get out of its line of sight. Let's address first this issue. What is happening is that, we are not actually telling the enemy to stop shooting when not seeing the player. First let's organize the events. Drag down the enemy fire event to the bottom. And add a new action where we are setting the value of the player in range to 0. This means that every time we will shoot, we will consider that we stopped seeing the player and we could move. But now, move the Raycast event to the beginning of the enemy group as to have the game check if the player is in range before any other action. Another improvement that we can actually do, is to put the entire enemy fire as a sub-event of the Raycast event, in which case it will only be executed with the player is in range. This means that we don't need to check if we are in range in the condition, because the entire event will only be run if the Raycast hits the player. We can also delete the condition has fired, because we are not actually using it. Since we are touching the enemy firing event, let's implement fire rounds as to have the enemy shoot a couple of bullets, and then, pause for a couple of seconds before shooting again. Let's go the scene view and select the physic enemy object and right-click on it, and then, select the action edit object variable. Add a couple of new variables, fire rounds and rounds interval. Click apply to save, and go back to the events manager to add the needed events. Since we have forgotten a couple of times to initialize the variables, let's start by this. Go to the top of the events on beginning of the scene, and add an action to initialize the physic enemy's value of object variable fire rounds to 5. This will make the enemy fire 5 bullets before pausing for a brief moment to be defined. Repeat the process for the physic enemy variable rounds interval, setting its value to 2. We will also need a timer associated with the controlling the rounds timing, so let's initialize immediately it. Add a new action, select physic enemy and then reset value of timer that we are going to name next round. To make it affect the timings of the shooting, we need to go the block of events where we are checking if the player is in range with the Raycast and create there a new sub-event by clicking on the top bar button Add Sub-Event. We need to make sure that the new sub-event is located before the firing event, so if it is not the case, like in our code, we need to move it before the actual shooting takes place. For the condition, check if the physic enemy value of timer next round is higher than the value of object variable rounds interval. In which case we should fire. Once done, drag the enemy fire event to the right to make it a sub-event of the newly created event checking on the round's timing. If the timer for the next round has expired, then we should have an action that resets it to start counting again. So, add an action for physic enemy that makes this reset the timer next round. Let's check the result. The enemy stops moving and immediately starts firing at the player. We can also see that the shooting never pauses or stops. This is because we are not yet counting the number of bullets being fired in each round. Let's fix it. Let's go to the scene view. First we will need to add to physic enemy, a new object variable that we will name round fired, and that will hold the number of bullets fired in each round. Go to the Events Manager, and in the enemy firing event, let's add a new action for the physic manager object variable round fired, that will add 1 for each bullet fired. Now, we need to add to the event's condition, a check on if the number of bullets fired, represented by the variable round fired, is smaller than the actual amount of bullets to be fired, which is kept in the variable fire rounds. Let's add a new sub-event too, that when the value of round fired is higher than the value of fire rounds, then we should reset the timer next round as to restart counting from 0. Let's check the game. And now, we can see that after the first round, the enemy stops firing and don't restart. This is because we are not resetting the value of round fired to 0. So let's add the action to reset the physic enemy variable object round fired to 0. Another thing that needs to happen too, is the reset of the physic enemy timer next fire as to make sure that we can start firing immediately. So copy it from the actions of the enemy fire and paste it in the sub-event. Let's check the game once more. And nope. It isn't restarting the round. Okay. We have another thing that we need to modify. The value of the condition is currently set to higher, but it should actually be higher or equal, because we want to reset it as soon as the value is at least equal to the limit. Recheck time. And now everything seems to be working correctly. Except for the fact that the enemy is being controlled by us. This is actually easy to solve. Let's go to the scene view and double click on physic enemy. Go to the behaviors and then uncheck the default controls. This was basically telling the object that it was controlled by the standard controls. Let's do some cleaning on the events and make sure that everything is correctly indented. Let's also change where we are setting the player to be in range. Let's add a new event inside the enemy group right before the raycasting event. Leave the condition empty as to be run on every frame, and move the action that sets the player in range to 0, to the actions of the new event. This will make the player not to be in range of the enemy in each frame, and if actually is, then the raycast will set it again as to be in range, and if not, the enemy will move on to perform other actions. Time to make a final check on this mechanics. But we still have a problem. The enemy, when recovering the vision of the player, is firing in the wrong direction. This is because the character angle is wrong, and when we are moving back and forth we are not actually changing the angle of movement of the enemy. So we need to do it. For that, in the events where we were checking the collisions with the direction blocks, we need also to set the angle propriety of the physic enemy to the right angle. 0 when going to the right and 180 when going to the left. We can now move out of the line of sight of the enemy and it will get back to patrolling. And now yes. Everything is working correctly with the enemy firing at us from the right distance and in the right direction. To finish the enemy implementation, let's actually make it a little bit more threatening than just a red box. For this, let's create a new enemy sprite and create 2 new animations, one for the enemy walking and another from the enemy firing. Since we have done these steps several times in the tutorial, we are not going to comment on every step, but we will keep the video at its regular speed to help you follow along in case you could have any doubts. The files for the enemy sprite can be found on the description. Upload the animations and set the loop option. Edit the points to set the origin of the sprite in center bottom of the sprite. Make sure to have the two blue slide buttons to blue to apply the change to all animations. Let's also edit the origin of the sprite and create an image point fire bullet which will be used to fire the bullets from. Let's go back to the events, and the first thing that we need to do, is to go to the event where we match the position of the physic player to the player sprite, and replicated it for the new enemy sprite in the physic enemy object. Then go the top of the events on begin of the scene and hide the physic enemy object. We also need to make the initialization of the sprite flipping as to match the initial motion of physic enemy. In the enemy fire event, let's modify the position where the bullets and effects are being spawned, and replace them by the new image point. Enemy sprite point X fire bullet and enemy sprite point Y fire bullet. In the events associated the direction blocks, let's add actions to flip the enemy sprite in the right direction. And then in the events that makes the enemy move or stop, change the animations by name to walk or idle. So everything is working. There are some improvements we could do, as for instance when the enemy is pausing between rounds of fire, it is still playing the attack animation, where probably we could have made it to go to idle. But this video is already very long again, and we will have to left it for another episode. We hope that you have liked this video. If it has been the case, consider subscribing, giving a like and clicking on the notification button. If you have any question, problem or comment, don't hesitate in putting a comment and we will answer as fast as we could. See you in the next video, game developers.